Mercedes may have just lost the one advantage that made them unbeatable right before Japan. Because after dominating Australia and China in the 2026 season, the FIA stepped in and closed a loophole inside their engine. Not a rumor. Not speculation. A real regulatory change, targeting exactly what rivals believed Mercedes was exploiting. And here is why this is massive. Mercedes was not just winning. They were controlling races without even being the fastest in top speed. Which means their advantage was hidden. In efficiency. In energy. In something no one else could match. Until now. Because the moment the FIA confirmed that engines could exceed limits under real conditions, they changed the rules. Immediately. Effectively banning that gray area. So now everything comes down to one question. Was that the key to their dominance, or just one piece of something much bigger? Because in just a few days, at Suzuka, we are about to find out. Subscribe now, because what happens next could flip the entire championship. At first, it did not look like a controversy. It looked like dominance. Australia was not close. China was even worse. Mercedes did not just win both races, they controlled them from start to finish. Front row lockouts. Clean race pace. No pressure. No real fight. And in Formula One, when a team looks that comfortable this early in a new regulation era, something always feels off. Because this is 2026. New engines. New energy systems. New everything. No team is supposed to understand it this quickly. And yet, Mercedes did. But here is where the first crack appeared. The data did not match the results. Because when engineers started analyzing the numbers, something strange came up. Mercedes was not dominating the speed traps. They were not the fastest at the end of the straight. In some cases, customer teams using the same engine were actually faster. And that should not happen. Because if the engine is the same, the output should be similar. But it was not. Mercedes was doing something different. Something hidden. And it was not visible in a single metric. It was spread across the entire lap. They were faster where it mattered. At the exact moment of acceleration. At the end of energy deployment. At the point where other cars started to lose performance. And that is where suspicion started to grow. Because this was not raw power. This was efficiency. A level of energy control that did not make sense this early. And that is when rival teams stopped looking at the lap time. And started looking at the engine itself. Because if the advantage is not visible on the surface, then it is coming from somewhere deeper. And that is when one specific area became the center of attention. Not aerodynamics. Not setup. The compression ratio. A rule that seemed simple, but was about to expose something much bigger. Because the compression ratio sounds simple, until you understand what it really controls. It defines how much energy the engine can extract from every single combustion cycle. More compression means more efficiency. More efficiency means more usable energy across the lap. And in 2026, that is everything. Because this era is not about raw horsepower anymore. It is about how you generate, store, and deploy energy. So when the rules say there is a maximum limit, 16:1, that is supposed to keep everyone within the same performance window. But here is where the entire situation breaks. That limit was not originally enforced under real racing conditions. It was measured in static tests, cold conditions, controlled environments. And Formula One engines do not live in those conditions. They operate under extreme heat, extreme pressure, constant variation. Which means one critical possibility. An engine can pass every official test, and still behave completely differently when it is actually running on track. And that is exactly what rival teams started to suspect. Because if you design an engine that stays within the limit when cold, but exceeds it when hot, you unlock something no one else has. More combustion efficiency. More energy generation. More performance, without technically breaking the rules. And that is where this stops being a theory. Because even the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile admitted it. There were ways to increase compression when the engine is running in real conditions. That single statement confirms everything. The loophole was real. The possibility existed. And someone found a way to use it. Now here is where the tension explodes. Because if one team gains that advantage at the start of a new regulation era, the consequences are massive. They do not just win races. They build momentum. They develop faster. They understand the system before anyone else. And the gap grows. So the reaction from rivals was immediate. Not just technical. Political. Because when you cannot replicate something quickly, you try to remove it. And that is exactly what happened. Pressure from multiple manufacturers. Questions raised internally. Conversations with the governing body. All pointing to the same issue. This rule was not being enforced the way it was intended. And once that becomes clear, There is only one outcome. The rule has to change. Not later. Now. Because the longer it stays open, the bigger the advantage becomes. And that is why, just days before Suzuka, everything shifted. Not on track. In the rulebook. And this is where the situation stops being theoretical and becomes real. Because once the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile steps in, everything changes instantly. Not in the garage. Not in simulations. In the rules. Because the moment they confirmed that engines could exceed the intended compression under real conditions, they acted. They closed the gap. They updated how the system is measured. From now on, compression is no longer checked only in controlled environments, but also under real operating conditions. Which means the gray area is gone. The flexibility is gone. The advantage is effectively removed. And that is why this feels like a ban. Not because something illegal was found, but because something too effective has been neutralized. But here is where things become even more intense. Because this change does not reset the season. Mercedes is still ahead. They already built their car around this concept. They already optimized everything around that performance window. So even if the rule closes the loophole, the knowledge remains. The understanding remains. And that is what makes this so dangerous for the rest of the grid. Because now, every other team is chasing something they only just understood, while Mercedes has been refining it for months. But there is another layer to this. Because removing the loophole does not just affect peak performance. It affects how the entire system behaves. Energy deployment, combustion efficiency, thermal behavior. Everything connected to how the engine operates under load. Which means Mercedes now has to adapt. Not rebuild, but adjust. Rebalance the system. Find a new way to reach the same result, without the same mechanism. And doing that, in the middle of a season, is one of the hardest things in Formula 1. But this is where Suzuka becomes critical. Because Suzuka is not just a race. It is a stress test. High-speed corners. Long, flowing sections. Constant demand on energy systems. If there is even a small loss of efficiency, it will show immediately. Not in one corner. Across the entire lap. And that is why every team is watching closely. Because they are not just looking at lap time. They are looking at behavior. How the car accelerates. How it deploys energy. How it performs at the end of straights. Because that is where the difference will appear. And this leads to the final question. The one that defines everything. Was this loophole the foundation of Mercedes' dominance? Or just one piece of a much bigger system? Because if it was the foundation, Suzuka will expose it. The gap will shrink. The fight will return. But if it was only a detail, then something much more serious is happening. Because it would mean Mercedes is still ahead, even after losing the one thing everyone was chasing. And that is the moment where dominance stops being questioned. And starts being feared. And this is where everything finally gets decided. Because Suzuka is not just another race on the calendar. It is the moment where theory meets reality. Where everything Mercedes has built is put under pressure for the first time. Not from rivals. From the rules. Because until now, Mercedes controlled the narrative. They were faster. Smarter. More efficient. Always one step ahead. But now, that advantage is no longer invisible. Everyone knows where to look. Everyone knows what changed. And that changes the entire dynamic. Because in Formula 1, once your secret is understood, it becomes a target. And targets get chased. Fast. But here is where things become even more intense. Because Mercedes is not just defending performance. They are defending their identity in this new era. A philosophy built around energy control. Around precision. Around extracting performance where others lose it. And if that philosophy is still intact, then Suzuka will look exactly the same. Clean. Controlled. Untouchable. But if even a small part of that system depended on the gray area that just disappeared, then the cracks will show. Not dramatically. Subtly. A little less speed at the end of the straight. A slightly weaker exit. A small loss in efficiency. And in Formula 1, that is enough. Enough for Ferrari to close in. Enough for Red Bull to apply pressure. Enough for the entire grid to feel that Mercedes is no longer out of reach. And that is how dominance begins to collapse. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Corner by corner. Lap by lap. But here is the final layer. Because what happens in Japan does not stay in Japan. It defines the season. Because if Mercedes proves they can win without that advantage, then everything changes. Because it means this was never about a loophole. It was about mastery. A deeper understanding of the most important part of 2026. Energy. And if that is true, then catching them becomes something much harder. Not a technical challenge. A conceptual one. But if they struggle, if the gap disappears, if the fight comes back immediately, then the story flips. Because it means that hidden advantage was real. It mattered. And now, it is gone. So when the cars line up in Suzuka, when the lights go out, when that first full push lap begins, we are not just watching a race. We are watching the truth unfold. The truth about Mercedes. The truth about their engine. The truth about whether their dominance was built on something temporary, or something far more powerful. And the real question is no longer who will win the Japanese Grand Prix. The real question is, what version of Mercedes is about to be revealed when it matters most? And this is where the story reaches its final layer. Because everything we have seen so far, the dominance, the controversy, the rule change, all of it leads to one unavoidable conclusion. Mercedes forced Formula One to react. Not with a penalty. Not with a disqualification. With a rule change. And that is one of the clearest signals you can get in this sport. Because when the governing body changes the way something is measured, mid-season, it means someone found something powerful enough to break the balance. But here is the part that changes everything. That kind of advantage does not appear by accident. It comes from understanding something before everyone else. Seeing the gap. Building around it. Optimizing it. And that is exactly what Mercedes did. They did not just build a fast car. They built a system. A system that extracts energy better. Uses it smarter. Deploys it at the exact moment where others lose it. And that is why this moment is so important. Because now that one piece of that system has been removed, we finally get to see what is left. The real foundation. The real strength of the project. Because if Mercedes still dominates in Suzuka, then the message is clear. They were never relying on one trick. They were ahead in everything. But if they do not, if the gap closes, if the fight returns instantly, then we finally understand how much that hidden advantage mattered. And that is the moment Formula One has been waiting for. Not the investigation. Not the controversy.